You are now tuned into Muse News, the podcast where we talk about all things Memorial University and beyond. Today, joined with us in the CHMR studios is a very special guest. We have Charlie Angus. He was the MP for Timmins-James Bay from 2004 to 2025. He's the author of 9 books, and he is the writer of the Resistance Substack and social media. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio, Charlie.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, just recently, you were quoted in the New York Magazine. You think I'm going to let that effing criminal take my country? Not a chance. What has got you so fired up about this recent rhetoric, attacks, and actions from our southerly neighbor?
I woke up the morning after the Trump election and I didn't get out of bed. I think a lot of people just thought, what the heck happened? And had no idea how dark it was going to be. But when you elect a convicted criminal who launched an insurrection against the government of the United States and you let that man back in power, you know you're in deep trouble. And I didn't even know what to think. And my wife called me at 8:30 in the morning. I was in Ottawa. She was in Northern Ontario. She said, why haven't you said anything yet? Why haven't you posted something? And I said, I don't know what to say. She said, you start speaking because people need a voice. We're dealing with an age of darkness. We're dealing with, as Gramsci says, we're in the age of monsters. And we need to start talking about that. What shocked me was that so many of our pundits, our talking heads, were just carrying on as though life, it was just Trump being Trump. No, we are descending into authoritarian gangsterism, and the threats against Canada are serious. So what I began doing was just trying to articulate, trying to find language, trying to talk about what it would take to defend our democracy from that kind of threat. What's been absolutely mind-blowingly incredible is how ordinary Canadians have understood this from the get-go. So what the resistance is now is trying to build this network across Canada. And from that, I'm receiving messages every day from across the United States, from across the world. People are watching Canada, and we're not getting the pat on the back from our intellectual class, but Canadians are holding the line, and we have to hold the line. We are the front line in the fight for democracy right now.
So, what does Canadian government and Canadians need to do to fight back against Trump at this day and age?
We need to be able to call this threat for what it is. This is Grifter Fascism. This is not Trump negotiating and playing hardball, the art of the deal. This guy has no moral base. I think our Prime Minister needs to understand, and our premiers need to understand, that this is a bigger threat, an existential threat to our nation. That's what we need from our leaders, is that willingness to recognize this and to, if necessary, hunker down and take, I think, very hard lines to defend us. Ordinary Canadians, this boycott that Canadians have started is a political tool that's, I think it's unprecedented what's happened, because boycotts are very powerful tools, but boycotts are organized, boycotts are planned. This was organic. Ordinary Canadians just said, I am not going back to Florida. I am not going to Arizona. I am not going to buy another product from the United States. That economic boycott is creating enormous pressure in the United States. But what we need to do, I think, most of all, is we cannot let the disinformation mob, the haters, the MAGA Maple crew divide us from each other. We have to stay very solid and very unified at this moment.
So you've been speaking across the country with crowds in different cities about the resistance. What is the response you've been getting so far in different cities?
The response that we get for the resistance rallies are incredible. It's very emotional, seeing people who come out and who understand. This is about defending not just our border or our flag, but defending our values of decency, of inclusivity, of fairness. These are fundamental Canadian values, the values of our cooperative spirit that they're trying to crush, and that I think that the right in Canada have been trying to crush for a long time. The Pierre Poilievre, Canada's broken, false lies about us. So in Edmonton, over 500 people. They were turning people away. We could have had many more. Vancouver Island, packed crowds. Oshawa just recently, auto worker town, on the front lines, facing serious pressure from the from the tariffs in the auto sector. In every community, whether it's a small town to major centers, we're seeing this determination, and we have to build on that.
So Trump has made it very clear that he wants to weaken us economically. He wants to annex Canada. What should the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, be doing to try and, stand up to this bully?
I've been trying not to second guess the Prime Minister. I think it's an all hands on deck moment. I was really surprised when the Prime Minister unilaterally dropped the digital services tax to get Trump back to the table, because Trump huffed and puffed and said he was walking away. As soon as the Prime Minister did that, MAGA was ridiculing us. They were laughing at us. Trump is not negotiating tariffs for the benefit of the American worker. He sees these as public rituals and humiliation and power for him. And they saw Canada is weakened. The Prime Minister maybe fairly said, well, we're not negotiating in public, but he announced the drop of the digital services tax. That was done in public. And now Trump has thrown a 35% across the board tariff on everything outside of CUSMA and outside of the 50% on aluminum and steel, which is devastating. We need to hear our Prime Minister say no. We're not going to put up with that. We need to hear our premiers speak with one voice. The one thing I'll say for Prime Minister Trudeau is when Trump made the first major threats to us, where he did say he was going to break our country economically, the Prime Minister said, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, we'll go back at you. And then Trump threatened to escalate, and Prime Minister Trudeau threatened to escalate back, and Trump did the taco. Trump backed down. I believe the only way we're going to get through this is standing up to that. Will it hurt economically? Damn right it will. Will we lose jobs? Certainly. But if we allow this slow bleed off and allow Trump to put us in a box, he's going to keep coming back for more, because that's what gangsters do.
And what do you make of Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, and her response to Trump's tariffs and rhetoric so far?
We need to start calling things for what they are. We need to start calling out the traitors. Danielle Smith, when the rest of the country were standing up, she went up to Mar-a-Lago with Kevin O'Leary, a grifter who wants to sell our country out, and Jordan Peterson, who hates our country so much he moved away. She didn't go down, with Team Alberta, with labor and business to present a case. She went down there with the grifter crowd. I find it very convenient that as soon as our country was being threatened with being taken over, suddenly there was a separatist movement in Alberta, and Danielle Smith has been beating this drum of separatism. And I am appalled at our national media. They love this stuff. CBC didn't say, wait a minute, let's check who these grifters are. These are marginal freak grifters who are running this. CBC sends their flagship shows out there to, find out all about the anger in the oil patch. Canadian press, CTV, everybody's like, some loser, MAGA Albertan threatens to break up our country, and he's top of the news. Danielle Smith is out there beating the drum of breaking up our country. This is the talk of Vichy, Quisling traitors. And I'll say this, we cannot be divided from one another, because being in Alberta, you don't find people who are more proud, more sure of themselves than Albertans, and they love our country. So why aren't we talking about the great pride that Albertans have, rather than giving so much space to this grifter crowd? And Danielle Smith is MAGA.
And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, is running in a by-election upcoming to try and claim a seat and go back to the House as leader of the opposition. How do you think he's navigating this right wing of his party that might want to separate from the country?
I will say that I think Mark Carney ran on this wartime prime minister, and hey, we all bought it. We needed a wartime prime minister. He did the elbows up. He had all the language. His decision to give Pierre Poilievre a seat back in the House at the earliest opportunity, to me, is a real question of the man's judgment. Pierre Poilievre is not there representing the good of the Canadian people. I sat in the House with that guy for 24 years. There's no politician I have less respect for than Pierre Poilievre. He will say anything. He will do anything. He's a professional political arsonist. So if Mark Carney thinks that he's being, dignified and gentlemanly by giving Pierre Poilievre, who lost his seat, his own people voted against him, allowing a Conservative to give up his seat so that he can run in some safe, marginal Alberta riding at the earliest opportunity. I would have dragged that out for the longest time because I'm sorry, Pierre, you lost. So right now, Pierre is out there with the whole MAGA Alberta machine behind him. And what's he doing? It's going to be one relentless attack on Canada and the Prime Minister after another. So my question is, Mark Carney, come on. Didn't someone advise you what you're going to be dealing with? Because look what Poilievre did in the last 4 years. It was just like political arson of burning our house down. I sat in Parliament and watched it. The lies, the misrepresentations, the monkey wrenching of everything. Because it's really important to know that one of the principles of MAGA, it's a form of political insurgency. And to make that insurgency work, you have to make people believe that the systems don't work. And that's what the Conservatives did for 4 years under Pierre Poilievre. That was their whole mantra of Canada is broken, is creating an insurgency so people lose faith in their system. So I think the Prime Minister is going to have to show some real spine and steel in dealing with MAGA Canada.
So, yeah, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives were polling at very high numbers leading up to the election. Then comes Donald Trump with his trade war rhetoric, his Annex Canada rhetoric. What do you think changed there in that last election? We also saw the collapse of the NDP. What do you think is the future for the Canadian political left as going forward into this And do you think the right is going to make a comeback in the next election?
I think Canada was sleepwalking to a political disaster. The MAGA Maple crowd, the Canada's broken, the rage politics that came off, convoy and disinformation. Canadians didn't want to talk about politics. Canadians were feeling disengaged. The one good thing Donald Trump did was he woke our country up, and he woke us up in a big way. What happened in the last election is that Pierre Poilievre failed to shift, and the New Democratic Party failed to shift. We stopped being the New Democratic Party, a social democratic party. We became Team Jagmeet. I liked Jagmeet Singh a lot, but we became a leader-focused party offering the leader at a time when Canadians were freaking out about Trump. We missed the mark entirely, and that's why people voted for Mark Carney. What I'll say about the left is that we cannot go to a two-party system. We see what happens in the United States. We're already seeing it in Canada. If the only check and balance on a centrist, center-right liberal government is a further right party, we are going to end up not in a good spot. But to rebuild the New Democratic Party is a really important job, but we need to address a number of things. We need to be honest about how bad that campaign is. We need to be honest about the fact that for the last number of years, our party has ceased to be a social democratic party. We became a leader cult. Data is important. Fundraising is important. Getting really cool pictures of the leader on TikTok is important. But to be a social democratic party, what is most important is building that grassroots base and speaking for working class people and speaking in the small towns that we used to hold, the communities where we used to be strong. We've got to go back and start to build from the grassroots up.
So you ran for the leadership of the NDP back in 2017. Looking forward to this next leadership election, what do you think is going to make the best kind of leadership race and to find the best leader here and for the Canadian New Democratic Party?
I came off the election feeling pretty burnt out and cynical, but then on my resistance rallies and tours, I'm meeting young New Democrats who believe in social democracy, and it's given me a lot of hope. I think what we really need to think of in choosing a leader is we don't need big ideas. I mean, honest to God, we got boxes full of big ideas. We got boxes of big ideas going back to the 1960s, and they're all great. We don't need another great platform. What we need is a leader who can actually start the rebuilding to bring back ordinary people, working class people, people who used to just look to New Democrats because they knew They didn't have to agree with us on everything, but they knew we fight like hell for them. So I'm looking for a leader who can do the building, who can reach out across the country, from our strong traditional prairie populism to the industrial belt in Ontario, to our urban support, to our rural support. I think we have a couple of candidates who will probably step forward who can do that. And people are going to learn pretty quickly it's really important to have a strong Social Democratic Party in Canada.
So you sat in the House of Commons for 24 years.
21.
21.
Yeah.
Okay, I missed that up. Like, added you a few years there, but you in 2005, I believe, you voted for same-sex marriage legalization, and being one of the only two Catholics, along with Joe Comartin, to do so. What was that experience like, and what did you learn from that story?
Well, I grew up in the faith tradition. I grew up in the time when the Catholic Church was into the social justice, social gospel, the liberation theology. This is what we were taught in school. So coming into politics, being on the left and progressive left, it made sense to me. I didn't expect that my faith would be turned into a political weapon against me by the Diocese of Timmins, where I was at. I was threatened with excommunication. My family stopped going to church. But what came out of that, I guess I grew up a lot because I wasn't expecting that would be the thing I had to confront. But ordinary Catholics came out in droves for me, because there's nothing like having a bishop telling you not to vote for someone if you're a Catholic, to know who you're not going to listen to and who you're going to vote for. Over the years, I've had many, many battles with the church. I've taken them on the residential schools. I've taken them on their failure to pay the compensation that's been owed, calling them out for their obligation to live up to reconciliation. But, I'm watching this new pope, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe the justice days are coming back, and but that was a hell of a baptism of political fire. Was my first year, and I was an international news story for being the first person threatened with excommunication in Canada in probably a century. Wow!
And so, throughout your 21-year career in the House of Commons, what was the biggest lessons that you learned sitting in those aisles?
I learned a number of lessons. I learned that our whole democracy is based on people doing, at least trying to do the right thing. That if people choose not to do the right thing, our democracy is fragile. And democracy is in a very fragile moment right now. Democracy is in a very fragile moment when dealing with fascism. Democracy is in a very fragile moment when you deal with toxic disinformation. Because you're trying to bend over backwards to present something as fact and to work through things. But if the other side is not willing to work in good faith, doesn't matter what your political views are, democracy becomes very challenged. I think we have to defend democracy now more than ever. I found many years in Parliament, absolute mediocrity, absolute just trying to get by, worrying about what the next poll said, whether we were going to get 1 point or 2 points overnight polling, which is all really stupid, meaningless. But we need to be looking at a bigger long-term vision, and I do believe that Canadians expect us to be honest with them and to talk about what's possible and what's not possible. I'd much rather hear that from a politician than some kind of glib promise, and that's what we get too much of.
And how do we bring democracy to Canadians, and what kind of forms of expression? I mean, you've been doing talks across the country with the resistance, but what can everyday Canadians, you've talked about the boycott, what kind of movement has to happen in order to stand up to Donald Trump?
I think we're in a very unique moment right now, because it was ordinary people who understood the threat and ordinary people who started the boycott. I find at the resistance rallies and the people reaching out to me, it's ordinary, everyday Canadians who understand the threat. They need to be encouraged to recognize that what they're doing is extraordinary. The rest of the world is watching Canada right now. We are the front line in the fight for democracy globally. But you don't hear that, from our political leaders. You don't hear that from our world-weary pundits on the Rideau Canal who sound like they're just so tired because they've seen it all before. Well, they haven't seen this before. They haven't seen this threat of fascism and authoritarian gangsterism. So admit that you don't know what you're talking about. Admit that we are in dark and unstable times. But ordinary people will stand the gaff. Ordinary people will do the right thing. And we have to have faith in that, and we have to encourage them. And so the best that I can do is I'm out there. I'm going to town to town, community to community. I'm writing every day. We're trying to do online stuff, and we're trying to do meetings just to say to Canadians, we've got something very special in this country. We've got something very beautiful. We've made a hell of a lot of mistakes in this nation, but what makes us different is that our decency, our belief in the rule of law, and our cooperative spirit with each other, because every community I've ever been in Canada feels like I'm coming home, even if it's the first time I've been there. We don't see that in the United States right now. We see a divided, mistrustful nation that's given into toxic politics. So let's support each other and support our flag, support our country, but say we're doing it to defend something greater, and that something greater is the rule of law and democracy.
And have you heard from any Americans yet on your tour and in your talks about what their reaction is seeing Trump take over?
One of the things that really surprised me in my 20 years in Parliament, I don't think maybe one or two Americans ever noticed anything I said. My Charlie Angus Resistance Substack is read by people in every state of the union. My online Charlie Angus YouTube network, probably I'd say a third of the comments are from the United States. Every day I hear from people in the United States who were just overwhelmed by the chaos and the threat and the gangsterism that they're seeing, of people being kidnapped off the streets. And I felt I needed to actually start speaking more to them as well, because we are in this together. Like the fight against fascism is a global fight. It's a fight in Europe. It's a fight in the United States, and it's a fight here in Canada, and we need to be reaching out to each other. So I'm trying to do whatever I can also to encourage the American resistance, because they are doing incredible things, and they're taking real risks. You're not seeing it in the media so much, but what they're doing at the street level is really, really inspiring, and we got to say, hey, that there may be a border between us, and there may be threatening fascist government, but person to person, people to people, we've got to show solidarity with our American brothers and sisters and with our cousins in Europe who are also standing up against Trump, but also standing up against internal fascism that's undermining all of Europe.
So recently you wrote about Donald Trump's bombing of Iran, and you've talked about the genocide in Gaza and what's happening there with the full support of the United States government and Donald Trump, who's kind of trying to play both sides, but is really actively supporting what many are calling a genocide. How does that play into this type of resistance movement that Canada should be playing a role in?
I believe that once it became okay to starve a people, then everything became possible. We all saw the October 7th attacks, and they were horrific, and the whole world stood up with Israel. And there was a real push at that time to get the hostages back. And if you read, Bob Woodward's book, War, it was very clear that Netanyahu had less interest in getting his own people back than driving this war against the people of Gaza. Once you can commit war crimes, once you can shoot journalists with impunity, once you can bomb hospitals and nobody says anything, then all things become possible. I really believe that Gaza opened the door to the age of the monsters. And what we're seeing now with the deliberate killing of children at aid centers, deliberate killing of children trying to get water and food by the Israeli army, and the dead silence from Canada, the complicity of the Europeans. Gaza is the place where the moral order of the West went to die. And this is what made all possible crimes possible. So we have to speak up. And there are voices, there are forces that really want us to shut down, and they attack. I mean, God almighty, if only our Western politicians were as upset about the murder of children as they were about an Irish band shouting from the stage, we'd be in a better world right now. So we're speaking up. And I will say that one of the amazing things I've seen is, like, people who started, like the Grandmothers Against Genocide. It started in Ontario. In fact, my mom was one of them. My mom's never done a political thing in her life. She just said to me, I'm going to just go out and stand on the street. I'm 85 years old, but I can't watch children being starved to death. And we're seeing these grassroots movements. So again, our media is not talking about it. Our politicians aren't talking about it. But the people standing up against the genocide, to me, gives me hope, because we're going to have to do all these forms of resistance from the grassroots up. We can't. Our leaders are not coming to save us. Nobody's coming in to do the right thing. The only people who are going to do the right thing are ordinary people standing up and insisting that they're not going to give in to the darkness.
Now, this is supposed to be Trump's second and final term. What do you think the future is for the United States going, for these next 3 years of his term? And what do you think the future of what you call fascism is in that country?
Well, I think I heard some Democrat the other day on the radio talking about the pendulum swing in the midterms. And I'm like, dude, if you guys don't get off your rear end, there ain't going to be no midterms. And what are you offering to resist? I think the political class in the United States allowed Trump. The mainstream media in the United States failed to call him out. And I was just on a really interesting panel in Timmins, Ontario with Gwyn Dwyer, respected war correspondent who's seen it all. And Gwyn said, I think we may have seen the last democratic election in the United States. There will be elections, just like Putin has elections. But the gerrymandering and the limiting of the democratic franchise, Trump is an authoritarian gangster. So unless the Democrats, someone gets some defibrillators out to get them back into life, this is not going to end well for democracy. Democracy is directly under threat in the United States right now.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for joining us. That was Charlie Angus. He is the writer and director of The Resistance. You can find him on Substack, YouTube, any social media. Thank you so much, Charlie, for joining us in the studio.
Thanks so much for having me.